From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about Yemen, the UAE military drawdown, and the potential impact and implications moving forward. To discuss the situation, I'm joined today by three excellent guests: Fatima Abo Alasrar, Katherine Zimmerman, and Jerry Feierstein. Fatima is a senior analyst at the Arabia Foundation. Katherine is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the research manager of AEI's Critical Threats Project. Jerry is senior vice president here at MEI and former U.S. ambassador to Yemen. Fatima, Katherine, Jerry, welcome to the program, and thank you all for joining us today.
Nice to be with you.
Jerry, let's start with you. For our listeners that might not be as familiar with the situation in Yemen, can you briefly recap where things stand?
I think that fundamentally the situation right now, I would say, is still stalemated on the military side. We haven't seen much movement. There has been some conversation about the implementation of the Stockholm agreements, particularly on security around Hodeidah. That has not really moved, and it's a matter of some question how significant the change is in the situation around Hodeidah. Outside of that area, we've seen a slight uptick in some of the fighting in places like Adale. And most recently, we've seen the Houthis perhaps trying to expand the front into Ma'arib and other locations in Yemen that had been more or less away from the fighting over these last months. Particularly Ma'arib had been cited and seen as an area where there was a lot of economic and other kinds of activity that was demonstrating how the fighting was becoming increasingly distant from many Yemenis. The big issue, of course, and the one that we'll talk about a little bit more, is the implication of the UAE decision to withdraw those elements of their military presence in Yemen that are specifically associated with the fight against the Houthis, but making clear that they continue to remain engaged farther to the east on the fight against al-Qaeda and the Islamic State.
Fatima, turning to you, what motivated the UAE decision and how much of an impact have we seen so far?
So what has come out from the United Arab Emirates was not so clear. And it was so much focused on Hodeidah. So if we would say what motivated them, I would link it with the Stockholm Agreement. The Houthis said that they were showing willingness by withdrawing their troops. And I think that the United Arab Emirates took a huge step by showing that they can also get themselves out of this, but not necessarily withdraw the troops because it's a handover to the Saudis. So for me, what this tells me is that it's simply the UAE wanting to make a political statement, and especially amid the escalation that's happening between the United States and Iran at the moment. The Houthis are backed by Iran, and they have been attacking Saudi Arabia on a very frequent basis, attacking airport installations, pipelines. If these attacks extend to the United Arab Emirates, it could be extremely damaging to its commercial and economic interests. So I think the UAE is hitting two birds with one stone, signaling to the world that it has a commitment to the peace process and showing to the Houthis and Iran that they're willing to reconsider their position if they keep them distant from Saudi Arabia. You ask about the implications. The implications for the United Arab Emirates is different than the implications for Yemen. What I'm concerned about is what are the implications for Yemen, for the government, etc. I can tell you that the general word in the street in Yemen is that the UAE is not really completely out. It's not for its military presence or might that it's known for in Yemen, but it's in its ability to back up militias, informal militias that was able to create from nothing. And it still maintains the links to these militias. So the other thing is that the UAE has always concentrated on the south and not the north. So there was this division of labor between Saudi Arabia and UAE, where Saudi Arabia was focused on Sana'a, conventional power, but the UAE was working on Al-Qaeda, counterterrorism, and pursuing its own interests, frankly. So this dichotomy was really seen from day one and has been really analyzed everywhere. And what we see today is maybe just a formalizing of what the UAE wants to do in Yemen. It's like, okay, you know what? We're going to stick to what we know and what we do best, which is the south of Yemen.
Katherine, where does this leave Saudi Arabia, and what are they likely to do going forward?
It puts a lot of pressure on Saudi Arabia to determine a way forward for resolving the war that is ongoing between the internationally recognized government of Yemen and the Al-Houthis. So Saudi Arabia is now leading the coalition without the United Arab Emirates in full support. So the UAE has made very clear it is remaining in an advising capacity, but it's not going to have the hundreds of troops on the ground supporting those fighters on the Hodeidah front, as Jerry and Fatima both mentioned. And the question that many analysts are asking is, can the Saudi military do this? It's not very clear that there's a military solution, but it's very clear that there's not a political solution at this moment either. And this goes back to, as both Fatima and Jerry mentioned, the Stockholm Agreement and the question of Hodeidah. That was raised last year, and it was seen as a way to build a broader political settlement, and it's become very clear, at least to me, that this is not going to result in a negotiated settlement of the war, and it's actually empowered the Houthis. So it puts Saudi Arabia in a very, very difficult position. The Saudis are going to need to continue to defend the sovereignty of their territory. So the Houthis have launched UAVs at Saudi airports and infrastructure in a very damaging way. They will need to defend themselves and also figure out a way to proclaim victory without actually winning the war.
If I can add, one of the other aspects of this, it kind of goes back to what Fatima was saying and also what Katherine was saying, and that is we were just in the UAE talking to people there, and one of the justifications, one of the arguments that they made in terms of why they're reducing their presence on the western side, on the Houthi side, is because they do believe that they have developed over these past several years a Yemeni military capability that they believe is sufficient to defend against the Houthis. Katherine's point again, the problem is that that military capability that they've developed is not associated with the government of Yemen or any other organized presence. It is an independent force under the command of Tariq Saleh, and how the Saudis will coordinate with that force and what the nature of the relationship is between that force, the Tariq Saleh force, and the government, and how you go forward in terms of achieving the objectives of UN Security Council Resolution 2216, which calls for the return of the legitimate government of Yemen, and what all of that means for the future unity and sovereignty of Yemen remains a very open question. So while the Emiratis may be right that this military force has the capacity to take on the Houthis, what are the implications for the future of Yemen as a result of the Emirati departure?
Fatima, on that point, there have been concerns raised that the UAE-trained forces in the south might kind of lend fuel to the fire of secessionism. What's your read on how that might play out going forward?
It may lend fuel now, whether the Emirates are there or out. The question is whether the Emirates right now would be capable of controlling these forces to stop them from achieving their own objectives, because Saudi Arabia has no interest in seeing Yemen divided. And I think this is where actually, a rift between the UAE and Saudi Arabia could happen if the UAE is not able to somewhat stop the secessionist forces from seceding. But I might be a little bit biased here because, I'm originally from the south of Yemen, but I've done also extensive research in the area. Back in 2013, 14, there was an overwhelming desire for secession. The situation today is different. It's different because there are other groups right now that have said to us that no, we want to see a unified Yemen state, and these are southern groups. So it's quite important that somehow the voice of the South is incorporated, and it's quite important that we start incorporating it now, not later, because otherwise things could really go out of control. The southern militias cannot move without some type of a decision made from the top. Currently, the Southern Transitional Council continues to be backed up by the United Arab Emirates. This, in the past, has been good because it was able to minimize from the opportunity of conflict. Besides the event that we saw in January 2018, no other event presented itself because the coalition was keen on remaining united in one objective, which is supporting the internationally recognized government of Yemen. Now, if this drawdown means that the UAE may not be capable of doing that, that's going to be problematic. So everybody, not just the coalition, honestly, the UN, everyone else, needs to find ways to continue to listen to the South, understand what the grievance is, and then understand how can we find a solution for that region that remains so extremely volatile and explosive.
Fatima, the humanitarian situation in Yemen has long been dire. It's estimated that 80% of the population needs some sort of aid. How will the withdrawal affect humanitarian efforts?
I would first start by saying I'm really skeptical that there is a withdrawal. So it's just a drawdown from Hodeidah. The UAE is still committed to some type of presence in Yemen, in the south of Yemen. And, this drawdown that has been reported, I still haven't seen any data or information that could provide a baseline for me to compare what was the amount of troops that UAE had before and what is it that it has now. So, in fact, I've even gotten very small numbers, like they've had 20 people in Shabwa, less than 100 in Aden, and that's commanders. I thought that's not a big number to begin with. So, as I mentioned before, their strength is in their ability to work with the local militias, create the local militias, and the strategy. So they move things across a giant chessboard, if you like. So this has been, for me, a tactical withdrawal, but I think they're temporarily down, but they're not out. So from that perspective, the Emirates have the Red Crescent, Emirati Red Crescent, and this has been their most significant force in the south of Yemen by the thousands. So it's also unclear for me if they're going to sustain that presence. I know some of the Emirati Red Crescents have been seen in Shabwa, south of Yemen, and 37 tons of food has been distributed just in the last month. So that's good news. On the other hand, we heard a statement from the UN Chief Humanitarian Coordinator in the UN Security Council just last week that both Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates haven't fulfilled their donor pledges. And he was urging them to just put more money. And I think UAE is $500 million out. So my only concern is that a drawdown might also mean a reduction in the level of funding. There is no reason for me to question anything right now. Again, I don't think we're able to compare anything, and we have to see what type of commitment the UAE is going to have in Yemen moving forward, because it said that it's committed to the peace process. So if it's going to focus on the peace process, it might want to focus on reconstruction and helping Yemeni people rebuild their lives. Because honestly, the sense in Yemen is that Yemenis don't need handouts, but they need strong governance projects. They need to create a stable environment in Houthi-free areas whereby they can say, we have a better model of governance here. They want services, stability, and I think that's important. Another detail, which is quite important, is that the UAE said that it reaffirms its commitment in fighting Al-Qaeda and doing counterterrorism programs in Yemen. And I think that component of security, of just providing that level of security and stability, provides economic opportunity. And it would be extremely important and would have multiplier effects on the economy and thereby the humanitarian situation. So that component, it would be really fundamental to improve the humanitarian situation.
Katherine, on the counterterrorism bit, I wanted to get your take on that as well. Do you think this frees up the UAE to focus more clearly on that going forward?
It certainly frees up the UAE planning capacity to focus on the counterterrorism fight, but they actually were running two different task forces. So just to be very clear, they're drawing down the task force that is assisting Yemenis in fighting the Houthis, and they're retaining the task force that has been focused since at least 2016 on fighting back al-Qaeda and training up Yemeni militias effectively to secure eastern Yemen. The question is going to be how far they'll be able to go, and this comes to some sensitivities between the Emiratis and the Saudis in terms of how they perceive the al-Qaeda threat in Yemen and who they define to be al-Qaeda. And then, of course, as we heard Fatima say earlier, Yemen had been a little bit divided between the Emiratis and the Saudis, with the Saudis taking the north and the Emiratis working in the south. And we're starting to hit a point where Emirati operations are coming against Saudi interests. So there's some tension between the coalition partners that I believe they're working through. But it all comes down to, are the Emiratis going to continue doing counterterrorism operations? Yes. Do they see that as an enduring effort? Yes. Will they be based there in the numbers that they are currently? They'll probably draw down a bit and treat it more as an expeditionary, sizing up when they need to size up, but trying to leave it so that the Yemenis are able to retain security in the area. And I think the key point that's been missed actually in the discussion of al-Qaeda in Yemen over the years is that what the Emiratis have been able to do in Yemen is degrade al-Qaeda and disrupt its activities to a point where it is much, much weaker than it ever was under the Yemeni government, even back in 2009 when al-Qaeda put a bomb on a plane that came here to the United States. That's very significant. So as we're looking going forward, I think the question is less about how the Emiratis are going to be fighting al-Qaeda, but how they're going to ensure that al-Qaeda stays down and out when we see and watch all of these other problems in Yemen bubbling back up.
We're running short on time, but I'd like to get all of your concluding thoughts on where you see things going from here. Starting with you, Jerry.
What I would say, and I think that the conversation has developed the idea that on the military side, we're not seeing very much change on the ground. On the political side, I think that there is a good deal of skepticism, really, primarily because there doesn't seem to be on either side of the issue any real sense that momentum has shifted, that they're under any pressure to negotiate. Nobody is feeling compelled to come to the table, as opposed to continuing to hold out some hope or expectation that they can achieve their objectives through the continuation of this conflict. There's an awful lot of money that's being made through the continuation of this war, and that is another obstacle to achieving any kind of a sustainable political negotiation. And what I see is increasingly that the country is dividing in a way that the conflict itself is no longer the most significant issue for Yemenis. Yemenis, to the extent that they can, in large parts of the country, in the south, in the north, in Marib and Jauf, are building lives that are quite apart from the conflict, and in a sense isolating the conflict into specific locations so that they can basically develop the country, which in some way is a positive development. And of course, it helps address some of the humanitarian concerns. It helps address some of the other issues, but I think has long-term consequences for the future of Yemen, for its ultimate security, stability, and national unity. And I would say that from that perspective, we need to be very cautious about how we move forward on that.
Just to add on to that, I think that one of the core challenges throughout the course of this civil war has been that the multiple other conflicts and grievances have been overlooked, and there has been little energy put toward resolving them. And these are ones that were left unsettled after the National Dialogue Conference that came out of the Arab Spring. And they primarily go to the centralization, or most Yemenis prefer decentralization of power, and how resources in the country get distributed. And what we're watching is Yemenis are starting to figure out what that looks like outside of a formal framework. So Yemen is becoming a fragmented state in all ways except in name. And I think that's a reality that we are starting to recognize. So the question then comes, what does the political resolution actually look like? And, is it something that the U.S. and the rest of the international community will be able to support?
Alistair, I think bottom line, the drawdown that was reported is not going to end the war in Yemen. And it's leaving Yemeni people feeling a little bit vulnerable. Even the staunchest of critics of UAE's agenda and the way it did its business in Yemen fear that the perception of a withdrawal means abandoning the country. And within that, I think that we need to really go beyond the headlines, beyond the feel-good thing of, this is a good step for the UAE, but why is it a good step for the UAE to do this? Is it really changing the dynamics in Yemen? Can it bring the desired security and stability? The uptick of attacks that is happening in Maghreb, where the UAE withdrew its forces, is something that should leave us feel really concerned, because it could undo the success that has been done in the past 4 years in terms of liberating some of the crucial areas in Yemen and bringing people a sense of just good governance. I know it's not there yet, but that's what they should strive for. As it is, critical areas in Yemen and the capital remain under the control of a group that puts sectarianism first and that puts Iran's interest first. And this is the thing that we have to keep in mind.
On that sobering note, we'll have to leave things there. But Fatima, Katherine, Jerry, thank you all for joining the program today.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.